consistent amount of feed. Now, I say consistent. How many days do you think I might go without increasing feed intake on a pen of feedlot cattle that weigh 1,200 pounds that have been in that feedlot for 100 days and are totally diet adapted? 2. Anyone higher? 4? What do you say if I said 25 to 30?
What? You're saying, you know.
I got your attention. That's good. Yeah. And I'm going to show you exactly why. Well, we're going to talk about it. It's called limited intake, or program gain, or prescription intake. It's called a lot of things. But before I show you what I'm going to show you, I want to explain something to you. Why do we push cattle to eat everything that they will clean up?
Keep them wasting the feed?
We think that. We do. You want to keep the rumen full. That's a great dairy thought. It is true in some cattle, not maybe in the feedlot. We do it a lot of times because the cattle act a little bit nervous sometimes, and we just can't see cattle without feed in front of them a lot of times. Okay, so I use a 4-point scoring system for feed bunk management. 0 means no feed remaining in the bunk. 1/2 means scattered feed. Most of the bottom of the bunk is exposed. A score of 1 would be a thin uniform layer of feed across the bottom, typically about 1 kernel deep. I'm going to tell you right now, the only 3 acceptable scores are 0, 1/2, and 1. And when do we check? I normally check feed bunks first thing in the morning, about an hour before I come by with the feed cart. If I'm feeding at 7, I go by at 6. Gives me an hour to get the feed next. I do it at the same time every day. If I'm feeding twice a day, I still check the feed bunks once a day in the morning. I don't overfeed in the afternoon. I don't jump them in the afternoon. If I have what they were supposed to eat that day, and I give them 50% in the morning, I give them 50% in the afternoon. In hot weather, when it's really hot, I give them about 35% or 40% in the morning, and I give them the rest in the afternoon, because I want the maximal heat of fermentation to be occurring in the middle of the night when the temperature drops, so they're under less heat stress. If I'm in Nebraska, I do the same thing because it's really cold at night, and I want the maximum heat of fermentation occurring to keep them warm when it's 0 degrees. Okay? Hit the next slide. Yes?
For those of us
There's one.
that are using a creep feeder,
Yep.
how does all this then work?
If you're using a creep feeder, they're on grass. And they're still on the cow. And that's not a feedlot. And that's okay. It's really, really good. If you're using a creep feed, like the feed you showed me earlier, on dry matter basis, I want it to be about 16% protein. Worst thing you can do in a creep feed is feed 12% protein creep feed, because those animals, normally when you're creep feeding is when the pastures are already low in protein and the cow is past her peak production. And so that animal needs some energy for a little more protein. It needs a little more protein. And so, just so you know the economics of creep feed, it takes 8 to 8.2 pounds of creep feed per additional pound of gain. So, here's the good news. If calves are $2.50 and your creep feed's costing you 15 cents a pound, it still pays. There are times it doesn't. If you're feeding out your own cattle, or you're retaining ownership and putting cattle into a feedlot, it pays because of the increase in marbling that you get. Okay, back to this. This is a score of 0. This is a score of 1/2. During a week, I want to see my cattle have this score 3 to 4 days a week. I want to see my cattle have this score 3 to 4 days a week. This is called slick bunk management because they've licked it. So if I see this 3 days in a row, 4 days in a row, I might increase the intake by 1/2 pound per head. I never increase more than 1/2 pound per head. If I see this, I'm leaving them right there. If I see this 80% of the time for 3 weeks or a month, I'm not trying to force them to eat more because I know that competition, everyone is eating the same. They're getting enough. How many of you may have come from a large family? How many of you have 3 to 4 siblings? A few of you. If you were the slowest eater, you were the skinniest. That's what we're doing in feed bunk. Okay, we're trying to get some competition. Now, you might be offended by this. I hope you're not. But I've worked in the university a long time. So I explain this in a very simple way. I've got 4 undergrads. And these young men are on limited budgets. And they decide to have a party on a Friday night. And they all agree to bring a 6-pack of beer to the party. But only one person does. How fast are those young men drinking that first beer?
No need.
2.5 to 2.8 seconds if they're any good. Because they've got to get there quick to get the second one. That's the same mentality that we're working with when we're feeding cattle.
It's not a very personal kind of experience there, Doc.
You'll have that. Okay. A bit closer than you know. All righty. This is a score of 1. If you spread that out, it'd be less than an inch thick. This is a self-feeder that someone is driving by every day. It's the least economical way to feed cattle. I don't want to see this. This happens when you're overfeeding your cattle and the storm front comes through. When barometric pressure changes, when you're getting a heat wave come through, if you're in the north, when it gets really, really cold. This happens if the cattle are being pushed and they were here. And then, my goodness, how do you get them back on track once they're here? You're guessing. I think the last night of the class, I'm going to show you some actual graphs of cattle that are on feed. And the reason this is so important. Keith, hit the next slide, will you please? Okay, I'm going to show you the results of the study that was simple and brilliant. This was done by Robbie Pritchard in South Dakota. He used yearling steers for this research. What I'm calling Lot A steers, they were fed using slick bunk management so that the scores were that 0 to 1/2. They were given only enough to clean up in 24 hours. Lot B steers were fed so that feed was always available in excess of what the steers could eat in 24 hours. It'd be equivalent to those last 2 slides. And here's the important thing to know about this. They weighed out the feed every morning, so that the results are not based on spoiled feed or feed that was in the bunk. They weighed it out, they remixed new feed for that Lot B steers. Okay, Pete. Lot A steers, controlled intake versus ad libitum. Over about a 180-day feeding period, there was no statistical difference in dry matter feed intake daily. Average daily gain, 3.78 pounds per day versus 2.07 pounds per day. That's an 80% improvement in average daily gain. Feed efficiency, 5.28 pounds of feed versus 9.5. How many of you are buying really cheap feed these days? Okay. This is pretty important. If you can save 80% on feed costs through nothing but management, because these were the exact same diets, that's pretty real. Why do you, don't switch. Why do you think this happened? It goes back to the hierarchy of nutrient use. Maintenance, development, growth. They ate the same over 180 days. How could that be? Hit it. This is Lot A's feed intake. Imagine that the actual maximum was 20%. 80% of feed goes to maintenance. So if I draw an imaginary line at about 16 pounds here after they're on feed, how many days are they above 80%? How many days are they meeting their maintenance requirement? All of them. Now, if I go down here and I draw that same line, how many days?
Quite a few they're off.
Quite a few they're off. And when they're down here eating 5 pounds, or nothing, or 10 pounds, these days that they are not eating to that 16 pound or so theoretical maintenance requirement, how much are they gaining? They're not. That destroys efficiency. That's the reason you have an average daily gain, of 3.78 versus 2.07, and a feed efficiency of 5.28 versus 9.5. This is why pushing cattle is not a good idea. This is why we use bunk management. I want there to be competition so that no matter what the weather is, hot, cold, rain, whatever, those cattle are hungry and they want to come to the feed bunk. And so when I say I won't increase cattle maybe for 2 weeks, it's simply because of this. And I don't know how to explain this. This is just what I do. I look at pens of cattle feed intake every day of my life because I feed cattle. And I look at pen intakes from performance beef every single day in different feedlots. And the crashes that occur when people make mistakes trying to push cattle, I can promise you in commercial feedlots, if you increase cattle 3 days in a row, once they're eating 2% of their body weight, they're going to crash. I make phone calls and say, do not increase tomorrow. I don't care where the cattle are if they've increased 2 days in a row. The program I use is I hold at the very minimum 1 day between increases. Many cases, starting calves, I hold 2 days. So if I fed an amount on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, I'm holding. Friday, I may go up half a pound. But it's very slow. Okay. Okay. So it goes back to why was that difference? The hierarchy of nutrient use. We want to feed, assure that we meet the maintenance requirements of those cattle every day. Okay. So this is the explanation. When cattle are fed, so the competition causes them to clean up the feed. Weather patterns don't impact feed intake nearly as much. Keep feed intake constant across days causes fewer days when they overeat, which reduces metabolic disorders like acidosis. When we control feed intake so there's just enough feed in the bunk for them to get there, they eat in excess of maintenance and they gain weight. Now, let me ask a practical question. How much bunk space do you think I need per animal?
2.
I need enough space for every animal to come to the bunk. It's normally, commercial feedlots are doing this on about 11 inches, 10.8 to 11 inches. I like to use 12 to 16. Because there's a reality here in that I don't need 3 feet for every steer to be there in an appropriately fed pen when that feed truck drives by. We use something we call the rule of thirds. When that truck drives by, a third of the cattle should come and eat immediately. A third of the cattle should be like getting up and sort of milling around, and and thinking about coming to the feed bunk, and a third of the cattle probably have eaten recently, and they're the laggers. So they come in, an hour later, you may see the whole bunk. The whole bunk with cattle at it, but more than likely you'll only have 80 to 90% of them there. You'll have all of them there for a short period of time. So, yes?
What's your ideal small feedlot at square footage for, 3 or 4 cattle? We got a lot of folks that, those cattle, walking around.
If I've got only 3 or 4 head of cattle, I'm going to try to give them about 50 square foot per head.
Say that.
I'm going to try to give them about, if the question was, if you've only got 3 or 4 head of cattle, what's the square footage that I would use? I'd use 50. A lot of places use 200. Depends on what kind of bedding you're using and whether they're running an outside thing. But if I've only got 3 to 4 head of cattle, I'm giving them 2 feet. 4 head of cattle is only 8 feet on. I'm giving them room there to come in. But I'm using the same thing. It doesn't matter if I've got 4 head or 4,000 or 40,000. I'm using the same philosophy on them. Because with 4 head, if you're small, if you're selling freezer beef, and you have one animal bloat and die, that's 25%. That's a huge economic loss. So on a percentage basis, you can afford it less than you can with larger numbers. Just because one animal is so much more important. Okay, what's the worst way to feed cattle?
A round bale.
Round bale and a steer stuffer and cattle in mud. If you have cattle that are walking in mud, you're going to increase the maintenance requirements depending on the depth of that mud, somewhere between 5 and 15%. Because it takes a lot of power for them to get up. It's like watching me get out of a chair. It's not a pretty thing. Okay. Feed cattle at different times. Oops. He wants out of this presentation.
He said okay, though. To be fair, you did say okay.
Okay.
I got you back.
If you feed cattle at different times during the day, you cause problems. If you feed cattle a diet better suited for dairy cattle, high forage, low concentrate, you're not going to have problems with acidosis. You're just going to have problems with gain efficiency and marbling. And if you substitute feed ingredients indiscriminately. What drives me crazy is when someone calls me and the price of feed changes the price of one feed and they're trying to switch ingredients all the time. I formulate diets with 5 ingredients and we stick with them. I don't switch. Now, if you're running a backgrounding yard and you're not trying to put finish on it, or you're running a grower yard and your business is byproducts, that's a different scenario. But if you're trying to take cattle to finish and you're always switching things out, you're causing a lot of problems because the cattle are constantly adapting to the diet and their management is very tough. Okay, feed additives to improve performance and reduce acidosis. In a conventional feedlot, we have rumensin. It reduces lactic acid production. In an all-natural program, there are products like Amiferm or Streptomyces or VCA products that are non-antibiotics. And we use proper feed bunk management to control the intake and to minimize feed intake fluctuations. Okay. So I showed this. This was taken last year. One thing I want you to know, once you get laminitis, once these hooves start to grow because of acidosis, you're not going to control that by having someone come in and trim hooves. The problem is not the outside of the hoof. The problem is a lack of circulation to the hoof. And once that is damaged on a 1,200-pound animal or 800-pound animal with all the pressure, after you've got acidosis, it doesn't get better. Okay, so this has tremendous impacts from an animal welfare standpoint. One of the biggest things with this is wet pens. And I'm going to talk about tide scores for confinement animals here a little bit later in the program. Okay, so if I'm trying to prevent acidosis, and I'm just going to compare these, Rumensin's and ionophore, it decreases feed intake. It increases propionate production, so the cattle gain the same with the decrease in feed intake, and you get an improvement in feed efficiency. Most natural products like Anafirm or Streptomyces, they don't decrease feed intake. The cattle eat a little bit more or the same, but they get an increase in gain and an increase in efficiency. Okay, the problem with ionophores is they're not allowed in many all-natural programs. And if you look at where, if you saw any news today, we're closer and closer to having greater regulations on ionophores at all. So there's good news and bad news. The bad news is that they are highly effective, that they reduce methane, so we're taking something off the market potentially effectively that is a real positive to the industry on several levels. But because it is a carboxylic polyether antibiotic, it is still an antibiotic, and we don't control the politics on this. They inhibit the growth of gram-positive bacteria that produce lactate, like strep bovis. The nice thing about ionophores, until the day they take them away, they do one beautiful thing for limiting acidosis. Most cattle come to the feed bunk about 8 times a day. When you feed Rumensin, they're going to come to the feed bunk about 11 times a day. They're going to get smaller meals, but more of them, which reduces your chance of acidosis because you have less feed consumed at any one point in time. So the pH drop isn't as great. Okay. They also decrease methane production. It decreases the heat of fermentation losses. It improves energy utilization. And Rumensin actually spares some amino acids normally used for gluconeogenesis. So the reality of it is you can improve marketing. We're losing this battle, but it's one that I don't think that we can fight. But I would say this, if you're feeding cattle, and if I look at Bovatec versus Rumensin, there's a reason that nearly 100% of commercial feedlots feed Rumensin versus Bovatec, because Bovatec is also an ionophore. It was developed for forage systems, and it's not as effective in a feedlot. Okay. So, I just want to, Anafirm's received a lot of research. It is an Aspergillus oryzae fermentation extract. It stabilizes the rumen pH. It can keep cattle healthy by reducing metabolic stress with lactic acid. Okay, you can switch. And the one thing, I did some research with Anafirm when I was at Ohio State. The reason I want to cover Anafirm is one thing, because I've got some research data with it, but I constantly hear how, well, we can't feed all natural cattle efficiently. The reality of it is, if you have really good bunk management, you can. We did one study where we added 3 grams of Anafirm to a 76% dry corn diet with 10% corn silage. We fed it for a 150-day finishing period. Versus no Anafirm, we had a 7.2% improvement in feed efficiency. And the feed efficiency was 4.8 pounds of feed per pound of gain. If you had told me 35 years ago, when I started doing feedlot research, that my most efficient group of cattle ever were all natural, non-implanted cattle, I would have said no way. But it is possible. These were a good group of cattle, and I will swear that by the feed bunk management on these, that is the thing we need to learn from this class, of anything probably, is just the art of feeding cattle is more important than the science in many cases. Okay. Acidosis is preventable with good bunk management. We can use manure to evaluate if some cattle have digestive issues, but it's only one diagnostic tool. Nervous cattle are more susceptible to acidosis than calm cattle. I'm pausing this for a second. If you have crazy cattle and they go to a confinement feedlot, I'm going to make one of you really uncomfortable for a second, but I promise not to harm you if you'll promise not to harm me. I'm a steer. You're a feedlot animal too. I come up to you. You're eating here. You're really happy. You've been here a month. You know this is your feedlot spot. I come over and I'm pushing you out of the way because I like the food that's right there. Is that uncomfortable? Okay. Sorry about that. Could have done it to you. You look like you did. The reality of it is nervous cattle don't respect other cattle. They're the cattle that run around the sides and they pump in. And most really good feedlots do their initial sort and they take those crazy steers and they put them in a pen by themselves. And they'll feed them out. They won't put them with the general population. They're the little derelicts of the group. Okay, but the bottom line is one crazy animal that doesn't respect that bunk system, because if this is a feed bunk, my aggressive cattle are going to come to the center third. My next least aggressive cattle are going to come here. My non-aggressive cattle are going to go on the ends, and they're going to circle back and forth. But the crazy animal doesn't care. It'll push in. There have been studies done that showed one crazy animal in a pen of 100 can decrease the feed efficiency of the entire pen by 5%. Doesn't matter how good of a diet you have. Yes, sir?
What about the marbling or what the crazier animals like?
They normally don't. They're normally
So
They're normally burning off so much energy that it's like they've got a diet, but they're probably not eating equivalent to the rest of the pen, and they're the nervous energy ones that are always walking. That they don't know that they're in confinement. You know.
Angus cattle.
What's that?
Dang Angus cattle.
Yeah. I know. Okay. So none of you, how many of you are in here are old enough to remember the Ankina breed?
The what?
Ooh, Ankina, 3/8 jump, 5/8 kick. Yeah, they were the common show cattle in the late 70s, early 80s when I made my way through school fitting cattle.
How are you pronouncing
Ankina.
it? Angus Kiamini?
Yeah,
Oh.
yeah, yeah. They were unique. You could walk up behind them and get 2 knee surgeries. Okay.
And they gave no bill.
No, they didn't. They didn't have time for it. So my final thoughts on this. We create most of our problems due to overprocessing grain. I should add, in pushing cattle too fast. There's room to improve management in most feeding situations to improve profit or reduce risk, and improve facilities that take advantage of technology are not only more efficient, they improve air quality and animal health, which improve performance and carcass quality. And what I mean by this is not wet, good airflow. I'll be glad to answer any questions. And then we're going to take a little quick break. Yes.
In a feedlot situation, do you routinely, periodically weigh to see what the gain is, to see how much feed they need to be getting?
So if in a feedlot situation, those weights are normally taken in a commercial situation at reimplantation time.
Okay.
So that's when they're normally done. More and more, a lot of feedlots are going to waterers that have a scale right there.
Okay.
So that the animal has to walk up to the water and step up on a little 3x3 scale
Uh-huh.
that has sides, and it weighs the front half of the animal. And there are all these algorithms now that can calculate the weight of the animal by its front half weight. And so what you may do without having to run them is have that in some pens so that you can track the weight gain.
Well, can I ask one more?
Oh, sure, you can ask. I'm here.
So a big thing, especially with BQA right now, is making sure that you have calves weaned and bunk trained.
Yes.
But if those calves aren't going straight into the feed system, in other words, they're going out on plains grass or whatever, what have you accomplished by making sure you've done that? I mean, have you helped anything when they're going to grass?
You may not have helped them at that point in time, but at whatever point in time they go to the feedlot, they know what a water is, they know what a feed bunk is. It's kind of like the same, it's much easier to get Greek-fed calves onto a feedlot diet than it is calves that have come in and never seen anything at all. And a lot of this is just reducing stress. I will take that on next week because I'm going to talk about how much a sick calf really costs you. Yes?
Following hers, so would it have paid to have them on feed to get, if you want to increase marbling?
Would it have paid what?
To maybe put them on some feed to increase marbling?
Yes.
Or at this point, it's not going to do any good?
Every day on a higher grain diet helps. The thought that marbling is put on last is absolutely incorrect. I've got a lot of data looking, so when I was at OSU, the OSU, not the orange one. Gotta say that, because I have a daughter going to Clemson, so I have a natural aversion to orange. A lot of the work that's been done by CAB has shown that creek feeding improves marbling significantly. And so we did a bunch of work looking at early weaning calves at 100 days and putting them on a high grain diet. And I've got papers that are published that cattle that were ultrasounded at 205 days of age after being on a high grain diet for 100 days were already average choice. In some cases, low prime. What they did from that point on was gain weight. And in most of them, their marbling didn't increase more than a third of a grade. They just maintained it. The muscles kept getting bigger, they kept putting it on. But we can feed cattle that are choice and prime really young in life. So the one thing I want to leave you with is marbling is not deposited last. It's deposited every day as there's propionate, as there's glucose absorbed through the small intestine, as that animal's eating in excess of its maintenance requirements. We take a 2-minute, oh, yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
I have two questions.
Okay.
So, did I hear this correctly last week, that you said the most inefficient way to feed your cows is to put a bale of hay out there?
Cows or steers?
Well, either or.
No, not either or.
I mean, which one would be better to put a bale of hay with?
Cows,
Cows that have calves.
yes. Totally separate
But if
thing.
you have steers that you're feeding out, you don't put a bale of hay with.
That's right.
And one thing that I have not heard mentioned at all is cottonseed.
Mhm.
And you feed cottonseed to cows and get the same results as you do with the corn.
No, because it doesn't have starch.
It does not have starch.